Right. Well, that is our cue to get started this morning. So, we are going to be picking up with Jonah, and we will be in Jonah chapter 4 this morning. We are in the last home stretch of the book. So, just to kind of walk through last time, just so we have our context for, Jonah 4. Last time we got through Jonah 3, right? And Jonah finally did the thing. He got up, he went to Nineveh, and he preached. And Nineveh actually repented. And God relents. And Nineveh's not destroyed. Actually, it seems like they have a whole, shift in their way, their culture. They've repented, they've changed. And now we get to see Jonah's response in chapter 4. So, chapter 4 almost entirely focuses on Jonah himself and his attitude yet again. Much like chapter 2, it's focused on Jonah and what he's doing, what he's saying, what he's thinking. But unlike chapter 2, it's not one of reverence this time, his attitude. It's something entirely different. Jonah here is much, much different than chapter 2. So, can I get somebody to read verses 1 through 3 of Jonah 4?
But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. Then he prayed to the Lord and said, Please, Lord, this is not what I said when I was still in my own country. Therefore, in anticipation of this, I fled to Tarshish, since I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in mercy, and one who relents at disaster. So now, Lord, please take my life from me. My death is better to me than life.
So, these handful of verses actually mark Jonah's true attitude, how he actually feels about what's gone on. So, just to cover a handful of this real quick. First, Jonah makes it pretty clear. He knew this would happen. Right? He knew if he got up and did the thing God asked him, Nineveh would repent. God would relent. Jonah knew what the outcome was, even when he went and did the thing. And he's still mad about it. He couldn't change what was going to happen, but yet he's still in outrage. Second, we see Jonah ran. He gives you the reason. Because he knows who God is. He knows God's one who's going to relent. He knows the character of God. Right? I mean, listen, it's a great description of God he gets. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God. Jonah knows the Lord, and yet he's still angry. And finally, we see Jonah would rather see death than the salvation of his enemy. He would rather go back to the fish. Remember chapter 2, where he describes it as Sheol and death the whole time? He'd rather go sit in the guts of that fish than see Nineveh saved. Guys, this is the epitome of hating one's enemy. This is the problem with Jonah. He would rather go to death than see other people go to salvation with him. Okay, so anything on verses 1 through 3?
It shows he hated them. He did not like them at all. It really becomes clear here. And it also makes me think God often chooses people that are the least likely to want to do a task like this. For example, Peter became the apostle. Peter was trained at Gamaliel at the table. He was a Jew of Jews, and yet he's the one that will preach to the Gentiles. You have a classic, very strong Jewish person preaching to the Gentiles. And to me, this is a classic example of Jonah was the perfect person God chose for the task because his hatred of the Ninevites.
Yeah, Paul is a pretty good example, right?
I think so.
He is the Jew of Jews. Is that almost how he describes himself in Greek on it? Is he was the guy. Yet God, literally confronts him, and he turns and he changes. He becomes, one of the majority authors of our New Testament. He goes to preach to all these people who aren't like him, and he changes. And Peter's a pretty good example too. of a man who's changed when confronted with the will of God, go read the Gospel of John's depiction of Peter, particularly where it calls him Simon Bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah, and then read this book. You'll notice a lot of interesting connections.
Yeah, I got it mixed up.
I wasn't going to say it.
I appreciate you correcting me so nicely. Yeah, it was Saul that was the. Anyway, yes, and it's amazing how God chooses people that are wouldn't be your logical choice for the task. Jonah wouldn't be the guy you would pick. You and I would pick to go. Hey, why don't you go preach over there to the Ninevites?
But that is an interesting thing here. Read the biblical text. God doesn't pick the likely guy a lot of times. I mean, the first shall be last. I mean, God's the God defying the odds. I mean, take David and Goliath. I mean, that is the epitome of this. That's not the guy you would go pick to fight a giant. But God did. And look where victory came. Jonah's not the guy you would go pick to preach to Nineveh, but it worked. And Jonah's not happy about it, but he's still the guy that did it. God works his will despite your attitude.
Thinking about what we studied Wednesday night with loving your enemy and stuff like that, this is the epitome of it. I mean, they skin people alive. It's not like they just kill people. They are brutal. And the fact that Jonah didn't want to preach him the message was because he knew God would be long-suffering. He would forgive them if they forgave him. That's what
It is the epitome of, I have it and I don't want you to have it. It's not love. That's the hardest thing God, I think, has asked Jonah to do here, is to love his enemy. We talked about it a lot even in here last week. It's a hard calling for Jonah, yes, but it is the fundamental calling that we're all called to. It's that very thing. The law and the prophets are summed up in this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's everything Jonah's worldview should hinge on is that. Loving those who are his neighbor, even his enemy. Yeah, I mean, Jonah's reaction initially of not wanting to do it isn't unique. I mean, Moses is a pretty good example, right? The burning bush moment, he says, well, I'm not the guy to go speak. I'm not the guy to talk. What? I'm meek. I can't do this. Isaiah does it too. Jeremiah does it. They all have moments where they question, I'm not your guy for this. But God very clearly but you're the guy I'm choosing for this. Your opinion of yourself is not what's going to validate the message. God does the work here. God validates the message. He relents. That alone is why Jonah should have gone. Jonah doesn't need to worry about God's part. He just needs to worry about his. So, anything else? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually, in the context of Jonah, that's an interesting thought, right? Is Jonah struggling with his will versus God's, and he doesn't see what God's doing here in its fullness, in its entirety, the way God does. But because Jonah goes and does this, you know who he's buying more time for? his own people. But is Jonah worried or concerned about that here? Does he see that? But does the Lord? Jonah doesn't see the whole picture, but God does, and Jonah needs to put his faith in that. Patrick?
I think I brought it up last time. In Jeremiah, the 18th chapter, so we're talking close to 150 years later, right? Jeremiah talking to Judah, right, to Jerusalem. And it's the kind of the parable of he's told to go down and look at the pot, right? And so that picture comes up multiple times in God's word. Right? God's the potter, he can fashion us the way that he wants. The thing that's interesting there in Jeremiah, the 18th chapter, O house of Israel, that's the end of verse 6. Verse 7, if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck it up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. And if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build up and plan it, and if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will relent of the good that I had intended to do to it. Now therefore say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, thus says the Lord, behold, I am shaping disaster against you and devising a plan against you. Return every one of you, or everyone, from his evil way, and amend your ways and your deeds. Verse 12. But they said, it is vain, we will follow our own plan, and we will everyone act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. And you tie that all the way to what the Hebrew writer says about the children of Israel in the wilderness, and what was their problem? It was their stubborn, evil, unbelieving heart. So it never changed with Israel, no matter what God did. And here we have this example of Assyria changing. Now, they didn't stay changed. Subsequent generations were going to go back to the way that they were. But ultimately, there's a judgment against Jerusalem here that Jeremiah is talking about. Ultimately, Matthew 21, Jesus said, the kingdom will be taken from you. Talking about the Jews, they're ruling in Jerusalem and given to a nation that will bring forth their fruit. So our challenge today is verse 12. Are we going to be like Jonah, and we're going to go sit under a board and pout about what God's doing for other people? Or are we going to get over our own stubborn heart and do what God asks us to do?
That is the fundamental question. That's the challenge of Jonah 4, really. It's the challenge of Jonah as a whole. It is that struggle, our will versus God's. It's one of the things we'll highlight the most in this chapter. This is the culmination. This is the moment where Jonah has a chance. The question is Jonah going to take it? Now, I think we all already pretty much know the answer, but read it with fresh eyes. Act like you're reading it for the first time as we do this. There's a chance here for Jonah. That's the point. Just like there is for Israel. The question is, will he submit his will to God? Okay, anything else on verses 1 through 3? If not, can I get somebody to read verse 4? This is simply the culmination of all the 3 verses we just read. All this scene of Jonah being angry and upset. And God asked him one simple question. Is it right? Is it right for you to be so angry? Jonah, is it right? I think it's a pretty simple answer. No. But it is the fundamental question. Is it right for Jonah to be angry? I think we need to talk about this a little bit. I want to talk about this with the thought of prayer in mind, because that's what this is. Jonah's praying to God here. I know we don't get the picture of him getting down on his knees, putting his hands together, this, that, and the other. But he's talking to the Lord. That is prayer. So my question is, what is so twisted about this prayer of Jonah's? What's so twisted about this anger and the way he talks to God in this moment? It is interesting. Jonah just wants it to be over. Literally, he wants just to go back to chapter 2 where he's dead in his own mind. It is odd how just he wants that so badly, because he doubles down on it later in the chapter. He doesn't want anything to do with any of this. Anything else you see here? True. He could have very easily felt used, right? It's understandable to an extent from a human perspective. He didn't want this to happen, but God, pretty much pushed him to do it seems. But that's one thing here. Jonah's had a choice the whole way through. He made the decision not to go. He's had a choice. What stopped him from getting to Nineveh and just sitting on the corner not saying a word? He got up, he went to Nineveh. He did part of it. He could have chose not to. Jonah still has free will through this whole thing. Anything else? I agree with you. See, I don't think Jonah's necessarily fallen into sin at this moment when he's saying this. See, Jonah's fundamentally struggling with his will versus God. That's the point. You just don't get this out of prophets often. That's why Jonah stands out. But I think what makes this prayer a little twisted, this anger, a little twisted, I think Jonah's missed the point of prayer here. He's struggling with his will versus God, and he's making it very clear, God, I want mine. I want what I want. And I got two passages I think we should read just to kind of support this. Both of them are in Matthew. I want to look at Matthew 6. This is the Lord's Prayer. This is, Christ teaching his disciples how to pray. And I want to highlight something he says right at the beginning. Therefore, you should pray like this. Our Father in heaven, your name be honored as holy. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When Christ is praying to God, he makes it very clear from the get-go. When he's praying to the Father, Lord, your will be done. Right? And this is something I think stays pretty consistent with Christ in prayer. Because later on in Matthew's gospel, jump over with me just to chapter 26. Same man praying. The Son of God praying on the night he is betrayed. On the night where he is sold for simply 30 pieces of silver. He takes a moment to pray. We'll be in verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he told the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. Taking along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me. Going a little further, he fell face down. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. He asked Peter, so couldn't you stay awake with me one more hour? Stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." See, Christ here is having the same struggle as Jonah. His will versus God's. And he says, God, I don't want this to happen. This isn't what I want. But Lord, I submit to you. Your will be done. Guys, struggling with your will versus God is not the sin. It's when rubber has to meet the road and you say no. Because that's what Jonah's doing here. He's done. He's over the struggle. He doesn't want to fight it anymore. He would rather die, go back to Sheol, back to the grave, away from the Lord, back to fleeing God's presence, right where we found him in chapter 1, then keep doing this. But with prayer in mind, these couple passages, this is what prayer is meant to be. Prayer is intentional, thoughtful, and ultimately it's contemplative in a lot of ways. Means of communication with the Lord. That's the entire point, is you're talking to the Lord, your God. And fundamentally, I think it's one where you bring your will, your wants, your desires, not to receive what you want, what you desire, and all these things, but rather to change them, transform them, to conform them, to be more like God's will. You bring them to God so they will be more like what God would want. Because it's not about getting things with prayer. It's about building relationship with the Lord your God. Lord, not my will, but thy will be done is the point. And it's working through that a lot of times with God. It's not always easy. And we see Jonah here. He's not finding it easy. Christ in the garden did not find it easy. And this is what Jonah's working through. And I want to highlight one more passage real quick to kind of go along with some of this. Turn over with me to Psalm 51. Psalm 51. It's one of my favorites, personally. This is, David after Bathsheba and the child and all these things have happened. And he writes this psalm of repentance, of change, where he's, praying his will out to God and what he would want. And I think this highlights what prayer should be. We'll be in Psalm 51, starting in verse 10. God, create a clean heart for me, renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not banish me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore the joy of your salvation to me and sustain me by giving me a willing spirit. Then I will teach the rebellious your ways and sinners will return to you. This is the attitude for prayer. A cry for change, not for desire. Guys, prayer is not I hit the button and God gives me what I want. It's God, here's all I have, all I'm dealing with, all the things I do want, but much rather your will. Give me that. Because in the end, that's more comforting than anything. Because his will is salvation. Anything on all of that? Yeah, it's a great thing to highlight. Jonah doesn't deserve it either. That's Israel doesn't deserve it. They make that pretty clear all the time. We've been reading the minor prophets. I mean, come on. We've seen all the sins they're highlighted through there. They're no better than the Assyrians. That's what Jonah misses. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to say, a lot of times you can look to these struggles and the things people have in the biblical text. I mean, take Hebrews 11. We talk about that quite a bit, right? It's all these people who are highlighted for their great faith. And every single one of them is a dirty sinner at some point, if you want to use that term. Every one of them fell into sin. I mean, Abraham's in there. He's a liar. I mean, it happens. But every single one of them is highlighted for their faith, ultimately, in the text. Because they ultimately said, God, your will. And if that's not encouraging for me personally, I don't know what is. Because, I mean, it's what Jonah's struggling with, his will versus God's. Corey?
You know, Romans 9:20 comes to mind. And Paul asked a question right before he started talking about the potter and the clay and so forth. But he says, but indeed, and who are you to reply against God? You know, it's the idea that our greatest example who ever walked this earth was Jesus. And I appreciate you touching on when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and praying. I do tend to think about that a lot. When he says, you know, if it's your will, let this cup pass from us. He has given us the example that no matter what we may face in life, as long as we are committed and trust in God, and what harm can really come to us? You know, I think Tyler said it best when he was preaching a sermon. He said, what is the worst thing that could ever happen to us? He said, if someone had a gun and he was going to point it to his head, and it either denounced the Lord and live, or confessing, I'm going to kill you. He said, what is he going to do? He said, no. So I think it's the attitude of heart, and like, you know, and depending and trusting that God is going to take care of us, no matter what situation we're in. And with that train of thought, and if you ever get to that point with your mind, then you're going to find yourself not really worrying about anything. You know, you are going to have that attitude that whatever happens, happens. And, you know, it's God's will. You know, just don't rebut and put on and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, trials, the tribulations, they're all pointing us one way. I mean, Christ came and suffered, died, and probably went through a lot more suffering than any of us will hopefully ever go through. But that doesn't mean we're exempt either. We all have our own trials and tribulations. I mean, we're wandering souls in a fallen creation. I mean, it's just what it is. So yeah, trials will come. Things will get hard. It won't always be easy. The struggle that Jonah's having here, his will versus God, is not always easy. Doesn't mean it's impossible. Actually, through Christ, it's very, very possible. And that's what we need to look to. Him through trials, suffering, and tribulation. Anything else on this?
You know, it's easy to kind of downgrade Jonah and think that he's a bad guy and all this, you know. He's annoying and he's whiny, but, you
Hmm. Yeah, I can easily. I mean, that's you get to first century Jewish text and Roman text on the Jews and their attitudes. They're exclusive, very much so. That's part of the reason that like people know who the Jews are, generally speaking, is because they don't get along well with others, because their God is the God, the one God, and they literally kind of will seclude themselves, ostracize themselves from the rest of the world. You can see how even here Jonah can struggle with that. And you're right. I mean, think up to this point, at least through a lot of it, it's just been the Jews. I mean, when they took Canaan, it was get everybody else out. Okay, we got everybody else out. Now keep everybody else out was the idea. Now, they never fully succeeded, but that was the edict that they were given. So it seems contradictory on the surface, I'm sure, in Jonah's mind. Why do I have to go preach to Assyria? I mean, these guys were horrible. You can see where Jonah struggles. That's, I think, what makes him so approachable in a lot of ways. You see where Jonah struggles. Especially if you're a student of your Old Testament. You see how Jonah could struggle. And he makes it very clear how he's struggling. God, you've done the thing that on the surface doesn't make sense to me. You relented to a people who aren't us. God, we were your people. Why did you relent to them too? Well, they did what you were called to do.
Now, this may be off base, but I'm kind of thinking about Peter too. The Lord came to him in a dream, told him to eat what's unclean. He says, Lord, what can it be? He tells him this 3 times. He tells him, he says, what the Lord has made unclean is unclean. And it's the idea of bringing the Gentiles into the church. When you live a certain lifestyle, kind of thank God that we have lived in certain rules, certain ways, and so forth, and all of a sudden, things are changing. It would be very difficult in many senses for Jonah, Peter, others. I mean, you're going to let these people come into it.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, on a human side, you see.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one of the biggest struggles of the first century church is Gentile inclusion. I mean, think about the amount of time Paul spends working on that topic alone in his letters that we have. It's Jew and Gentile get along a lot of the time in those letters. Jonah's struggling with that. The same issue, the same struggle is God, you're saving them too. And I don't know how I feel about that. But guess what? That's the case. Because God was never just the God of Israel. He was the God of the world. He created it. He was not just here to die on a cross just for Israel. He died so everybody could make the same choice. And Jonah's struggling with that same thought, that same conception that God might just care about more than just me and my people. Anything else? If not, can I get somebody to read verses 5 through 7?
So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat under it in the shade, till he might see what would become of the city. And the Lord God prepared a plan and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade for his head, to deliver him from his misery. So Jonah was very grateful for the plan. But as morning dawned, the next day, God prepared a worm, and it so damaged the plant that it withered.
So these verses kind of begin our final narrative movement of the book, right? This is, I mean, we're winding down. We're coming to the end. And I just want to highlight a few things we see here. First, we see Jonah, he leaves the city in and of itself and retreats to the outskirts, right? He just gets out of there, right? Which also is very interesting to think about where Jonah was praying before this. He was still in Nineveh. But now we see he leaves the city and he just watches. He goes and sits to see what's going to happen. He's still maybe holding on to some hope that maybe God will change his mind. Maybe, who knows? Next, we see the Lord appoint a plant, much like the fish in 1:17, to shade Jonah. And Jonah actually finds some pleasure in this. I don't know how much y'all know about the Middle East and how hot it gets there, but it gets hot. So it makes sense that Jonah might like some shade. And we see that God also appoints a worm to eat the plant and cause it to wither. So I have a question. What group is Jonah representing here? Himself. Pharisees? Not specifically. A little broader than just the Pharisees. It's Israel. It's his people, right? This is a narrative steeped in Israel versus everybody else. See, they're a group happy in the provision of the Lord, and the provision is withering away. That's what Jonah is starting to see here. That's what the minor prophets have been touching on. Look at all the things you've done. Look at all the sin you've built up. I have to do something about it. Judgment has to come. I'm no longer going to provide for you the way I did. Jonah, in a lot of ways here, in doing what he's just done, sitting under this plant, the provision that God provided him, that's now withering, is representing Israel. They have lived under God since the Exodus, and he has provided for them through the wilderness, into the land, through all of their history. And now we're seeing that provision slowly wither away. And Jonah here is very easily representing that. So, anything on that? If not, can I get somebody to read verses 8 and 9? So, we have our final words of Jonah here. And it's pretty sad. So, first, one last thing's appointed. We see a wind sweep through, the sun beats down because this plant is withered. And Jonah doesn't like it much. He's feeling all the effects of everything around him. He's finally having to deal with the consequence. And he's facing the consequences that God's no longer providing for him. Actually, something sweeping in will cause him some consequence. And it provokes this response. Jonah wishes for death yet again. He wants to go back to die. But this was the moment that Jonah could have stopped, realized what was going on, and maybe just repented. We don't know if he does after. This is, like I said, the end of our narrative here with Jonah. We just don't know what he does after. But through this whole thing, if he had just stopped and thought, maybe, I don't know. I don't know how much Jonah's thinking here. But this was the moment, with the plant and everything, that he could have just stopped. Much like he did in the belly of the fish, and just been like, maybe I need to turn back to the Lord. Maybe he can still provide. So that's what he does in the belly of the fish in chapter 2. He provides. He gets Jonah out. But when God questions his anger yet again, Jonah lashes out. He doesn't conform his will. He doesn't try to change. He's angry yet again. Kill me. That's what he pretty much says. I would argue he does need to repent for his attitude here. And I think that's what the narrative's driving us towards, is to see this attitude that Jonah has. Now, like I said, he very easily could have. We just don't know. And I'm not gonna comment either way on if he does or doesn't, because like I said, we just don't know. But I do think this deserves a critical look, and I don't mean critical as in, oh yeah, Jonah's just, he's lost, he's gone. That's not by any means what we're trying to convey. But when I say a critical look, I mean, look at the depth of what's going on here. This struggle that Jonah's, well, he's struggling. I mean, look at how fundamental this would have been to Jonah's identity. Because that's what the forefront of this, Jonah's identity. And I think we're starting to see it's upsetting him. It's making him angry. And you see that God, even as we get in the last couple of verses, makes it clear this isn't the attitude, Jonah. Mm-hmm. I would say it's a little bit of both. That yes, you get very much so. God's compassionate, God is loving, and it's not just for Jonah and his people. But at the same time, you're to learn from Jonah and all this and his attitude. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing here with Jonah. God still cares. Even with this attitude, with these things that he has going on, and all this anger he's pent up, God still cares. You see there at the end, God will question Jonah because he still cares so much. This matters to God. Jonah still matters to God through all of this. That's one thing. I know it's easy to get negative and critical on Jonah. And we need to look at it in some respects to examine the attitude and things to learn from it. But we still have to love Jonah. It's easy to be negative about him. And I realize sometimes I probably am too hard on him. But probably because I see a lot of myself in him at times too. But God still cares about Jonah, and so should we. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Yeah, God is love. But this is the question of the book, right? Is it right to be angry? This is the message. When other Yeah. Everybody struggles. Everybody's going to have this issue. Everybody struggles with their will versus God. And that's not where people fall into sin. The struggle itself is not the sin. That's one thing I think sometimes we can conflate easily, is the struggle and the sin. Guys, everyone has the struggle. Even Christ in Gethsemane had the struggle. That's not the sin. The sin is where that can lead you if you don't, change. Confront yourself with the Lord. Look at the things he said, the things he's done, and move with that rather than your will. We don't see what Jonah does here. It'd be interesting to see, I would say that, but we just don't know. But I think that's one thing that's being highlighted here. Jonah is struggling, but that is not the sin. Sin enters the equation when people have to make the choice. Do I change or do I not? All right. I guess we are done. Anything before we cut it? All right. Thank you.